All right, welcome back to the show. Thanks for taking the time to understand the Bible better, as well as how it relates to your life and current events. As always, do me a huge favor. Take some time to subscribe to the show on YouTube. It really helps me if you do that on YouTube. Over the next few weeks, what I'd like to do as we approach Easter is I want to dive into some apologetic issues when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. And so today, I'm going to dive into the theory that some people have proposed that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead because he never fully died. It's called the swoon theory. And the idea is that the Romans missed the fact that he wasn't fully dead. And so Jesus was wrapped up and he was put in the tomb still alive. And of course, they didn't bury people like we do in tight little boxes under 6 feet of dirt. They were buried in little carved out caves or stone rooms with a large stone rolled in front of the entrance. So what people are proposing is that this theory that in that nice, cool environment, Jesus was just revived. He started feeling better, and then somehow he came out. So what I want to do is I want to break down the problems with this theory, which is obviously just an attempt to downgrade Jesus' divinity. And so the first thing I want to look at is the medical implausibility of surviving a Roman crucifixion. Roman crucifixion was a brutal, lethal form of execution designed to ensure death. Victims were typically flogged severely beforehand, and we know that Jesus was. Mark chapter 15 tells us. And that alone, that literally, those whips were designed to even pull strands of muscle out of your back, which would have caused massive blood loss, shock, and trauma. The crucifixion itself involved nails being driven through your wrists and through your feet, leading to exhaustion, asphyxiation, and eventually cardiac failure. Historical accounts such as those from Josephus confirm that Roman soldiers were experts at ensuring death, often breaking their legs so they couldn't push up to get a breath to hasten the death. But what it tells us in Scripture that they didn't break Jesus' legs because they confirmed that he was already dead. So they instead thrust the spear into their side, which according to John chapter 19 produced blood and water. That aligns with modern medical understanding of pericardial or pleural effusion, signs of death, not unconsciousness. Not only is this evidence that he was already dead, it would have killed him if he wasn't. If somehow Jesus survived and he was barely alive, he would have to be barely alive in order to fool Roman soldiers who were trained to make sure nobody survived. He would have needed immediate medical attention. Even if he had gotten modern medical attention the moment they took him down from the cross, he would have still pretty much had a 0% chance of survival from his injuries. So the idea that he survived wrapped in a cloth, including his face, by the way, receiving no medical attention, no food, no water, but somehow he got up and he left the tomb is completely unrealistic. He needed way more than a cool, relaxing nap to get up and leave. Now, the second thing is this. Jesus' physical condition would not have allowed him to leave the tomb or convince his disciples that he was resurrected. Assuming that Jesus didn't die, he would have been in a critically weakened state, dehydrated, bleeding, likely in hypovolemic shock. Wrapped in burial linens and spices, the tomb was sealed with a large stone which would have required unbelievable strength to move. A near-dead Jesus, somehow revived, would have had to unwrap himself, move the stone, which estimated to be at least a ton, if not more, and evade Roman guards. Again, this is a ridiculous proposal. Even a healthy person would not have been likely to do these things. The more likely scenario, if he had just all of a sudden woken up in this battered state and stumbled over to the rock, a more likely scenario would have been that they would have found his corpse at the entrance inside where he had gotten up and tried to push the stone and eventually died of starvation or dehydration or died of his wounds. That would have been the more likely scenario. Like, even if he could have woken up, even if he wasn't fully dead and he could have woken up, the chances that he could have even step one, well, honestly, in that condition, unwrap yourself. You ever been fully wrapped up in something really tightly? You have to be able to move to start to apply pressure. If you can't even start to move, you can't even begin to apply the pressure to get out of it. The fact that he could have unwrapped himself and made it to the door, to the entrance, is just ridiculous to think that he would have made it anywhere beyond that. So the chances of a person who had been tortured to the point that Jesus had after losing that much blood, after being stabbed in the side, got up and moved a stone and overcame soldiers is absolutely insane. Clearly, he was fully dead when he rose again, and he used divine power to open that tomb. The third thing is this: the behavior of the Roman soldiers and the witnesses. Roman soldiers they faced severe punishment for failing to execute a prisoner properly. Crucifixion was their job, and they were good at it. The Gospels note that Pilate confirmed Jesus' death with the centurion before releasing the body. The soldiers' decision not to break his legs indicate that they were certain that he was already dead, corroborated by that spear thrust. Additionally, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus handled the body for burial, had this close contact with him where likely they would have detected some signs of life if they existed. The swoon theory requires all of these parties to be mistaken or complicit, which is unlikely given the stakes. Matthew 28 says that the soldiers who were guarding the tomb saw Jesus emerge, and it scared them so badly that they fell down like dead men. They were out cold. Something supernatural happened. These guys would have faced severe punishment for not securing the tomb when they were ordered to do that. In fact, Pilate had ordered them to make sure the body didn't leave the tomb because he didn't want the disciples taking the body and claim that he rose again. Why? Because Pilate paid attention to the things that Jesus said when he was alive, and he remembers that Jesus said after 3 days, "I'm going to rise." And that was the one thing he didn't want to happen. Also, these guys are soldiers. Not much scares them, but whatever they saw when Jesus came out just caused them to melt. The fourth thing is post-resurrection appearances. The New Testament describes Jesus as appearing to disciples multiple times and up to 500 people. Not as a frail, injured survivor, but someone functional and unrecognizable at first. In the Emmaus walk on Luke 24, and these people just casually walking with him. He wasn't unrecognizable because he looked like he had been beaten to the point of being not recognized. You wouldn't just start heading down a trail just casually talking to somebody about the Old Testament when it looked like that they needed medical attention, right? A revived Jesus would have been a broken man, barely alive, not able to walk miles, as in the road to Emmaus, or inspiring followers to proclaim a triumphant resurrection. The transformation of the disciples from fearful deserters to bold proclaimers is hard to explain if they nearly had nursed a half-dead Jesus back to health. Now, that brings us to the fifth one. The disciples were so convinced that he actually had risen from the dead, that's the topic here, that he was dead, that they gave their lives for that fact. If Jesus had just limped out of the tomb, still appearing to be beaten to a pulp, struggling to breathe, no one would have looked at him and said, "Wow, he died and rose again." They would have said, "He must not have fully died, and now he's in critical condition." But that's not what the disciples said. They were fully convinced that he had died, and now he is resurrected and healthy. We'll get to this more in the next couple of weeks as we break this down. But you have to be really sure that somebody died and rose again to be willing to give your life for that story. If you're about to be boiled or sewed up in a bag of snakes and thrown in a river or crucified upside down or beheaded, you're not going to stick with that story when what you saw was a guy that barely looked alive. I'm sorry, you're not going to give your life for that. Then number 6, the lack of contemporary counter evidence. If Jesus had survived and woken up in the tomb and somehow escaped the tomb, opponents of early Christianity, the Roman authorities or Jewish authorities could have easily debunked the resurrection by producing him dead or alive. It was clear that the Roman and Jewish leaders wanted to be done with this whole Jesus movement. In fact, in Acts, the Jewish leaders haul Peter and John in and tell them to quit talking about Jesus, but it was very, very clear that they were in this awkward situation because they couldn't disprove that he had risen from the dead. All they needed to do was go open up the tomb and produce the body. Or if he survived, they could have just pointed to his condition. Look at this guy, he's barely alive. That would have just ended the whole movement, and you and I would have never heard about any of this. There are no historical sources that propose that he did not die. Historians like Tacitus or Josephus treat his death as a fact, not a near miss. Also, if he lived, we would assume that he wasn't really God, so he wouldn't have just floated up to heaven after 40 days. So where was he? What happened to him? When did he die? Why don't we know anything about any of that? Why didn't they rearrest him and try to kill him again? We don't have any answers to any of those questions. We just throw this concept of the swoon theory out there and just kind of say, there you go. So it's possible he could have lived. Yeah, but all of the rest of this is impossible. And that brings us to the seventh thing, which is just kind of an axiom, like it's called Occam's razor. And it's just an argument. It says, when faced with multiple explanations for a phenomenon, the one that requires the fewest assumptions or entities is likely the most accurate. And so no doubt we're making all kinds of crazy assumptions when we're producing or proposing ideas like the swoon theory. We have to get around the fact that the Roman soldiers never let anybody live through a crucifixion. And in Jesus' case, they verified that he was absolutely dead several different ways. We have to get around the idea that a person who had taken that much physical abuse and blood loss just got better with no medical care because he had a nice nap. We have to somehow work around the idea that there was a 1-ton rock in the way of this weak man. We have to figure out how to get around guards at the tomb. And this crippled, weakened man would not have scared the guards so badly that they melted. We have to get around the idea that people would not have been inspired to declare that he rose from the dead when he was barely alive. We have to find a way around the fact that people that wanted to squash this movement didn't just put this whole thing down by simply showing that he was barely alive and then finishing the job. See, the theory multiplies assumptions unnecessarily compared to the straightforward claim of the death, burial, and resurrection, which aligns with the text's intent and early Christian preaching and what we know from history. In short, the swoon theory struggles to account for the brutality of the crucifixion, the logistics of the tomb, the behavior of the witnesses, and the historical aftermath. While it's a creative alternative, it leans heavily on improbabilities that don't hold up under close examination. The Bible makes it clear that he rose from the dead, and the Bible actually is an extremely reliable historical record. So, let me know what you think about this evidence that Jesus actually did die and rise again. Does the swoon theory make any sense to you? Or do you think that these points that we just went over convince you that Jesus fully died and then rose again? Next week, we're going to talk about more proof that Jesus rose from the dead. Make sure you catch the podcast every Friday at 2. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.